Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. This is my second video in my series of overviews and review analysis videos of the iconic classic James Bond novels. And of course, the second novel is 1954's Live and Let Die in the original Ian Fleming canon of James Bond novels. This is coming after 1953's Casino Royale, starting the series and being a fascinating blend of character drama with lots of introspection and also setting the stage for the series to come and having enough of an adventure flavor. But Live and Let Die is an adventure through and through with many of the classic elements of pulp fiction that Fleming was a lifelong devotee of. So this has all of the hallmarks of a classic adventure novel with all the wonderful elements of pulp fiction and having larger-than-life elements, but you do lose out on having as much of the deeper character introspection as the first novel, because Casino Royale is a different sort of tone and it's a different style of book, really. And understanding this is important because the Fleming Bond novels sort of have a dividing line. You have the books that are more what are termed literary minded, I think, is the easiest way to describe it, where in particularly the last few books, most of all, but in certain volumes, you'll notice that Fleming is trying to have more experimentation and more, for lack of a better term, higher concept in the writing. But then the other books tend to have more of a straight-ahead adventure flavor. Live and Let Die is probably the best example of this. So you kind of have the Fleming books, even though they do have different styles in terms of when they were written, they kind of fall into two different camps of having the more literary style novel and then the more out-and-out adventure style novel that you have most represented in Live and Let Die or, say, Dr. No, which is very much the sort of, at least patterned in ways on Live and Let Die, and of course feature not only Jamaican locations, but even recurring characters in Quarrel and Stangways. So it's really important to note that not only are certain Bond novels more pulp adventure stories, but the whole notion of pulp fiction and pulp adventure is part of the Bond formula and the part of the core of the character and why these stories are so iconic. They're supposed to move with a certain energy and a certain magic and have a certain drive to them, and Live and Let Die is pretty much nothing but narrative drive. The Fleming sweep that we all like to talk about, his incredible ability to hook the reader in and just have a continuous sense of narrative drive that makes you not want to put the book down, is at its most evident here, and it's essentially getting the reader into almost like a locked groove on a vinyl record of once you start the book, you really can't stop. And there's this sense of forward propulsion that also helps to smooth over any of the aspects that might be more objectionable, which there certainly are plenty of those, which we'll get to, but also certain aspects of the plot that might not be as realistic. It's only stuff that you start to kind of question later after you finish the book. It's the old equation that Hitchcock always talked about, the anecdote of if somebody questioned the plot of the movie they had just seen, it should only be when they're driving home after they've seen the movie where it starts to dawn on them, hey, wait a minute, or when they're in the shower the next day or something. If you have people doing that while they're experiencing the work, then the work isn't working fully. And Live and Let Die is such an experience that you can definitely get the sense that Fleming was emboldened by Casino Royale at least being received relatively well, even if it wasn't really a major seller. It, of course, would take many years for the Bond novels to actually fly off of store shelves or have any major degree of success on the book market. But you get the sense that now he's got the first book out of the way, now we're off to the races and we've got a pure out-and-out adventure. But again, I think a lot of people coming to the series for the first time, when you read Casino Royale first, it might be a little jarring going into Live and Let Die, but without understanding that this is the first true Bond adventure in terms of we've gotten all the setup out of the way. We've gotten the character introspection out of the way. We've gotten the setting of the stage. We've got the crystallization of the Bond character already done and over with. So now that that's been finished, it's now in the background, and now all the other books get to build off of that. So each of the books has a different flavor, but This is more of an out-and-out action pulp experience, and it has such a direct forward narrative drive that it's honestly an even more confident book than Casino Royale. And I think Fleming's prose has actually somehow improved when you read the two books in close proximity, back to back, or you look at the prose in between the two. There's this sense that Fleming feels emboldened, like he felt like his first novel was successful and it turned out well. So now he's poured on more energy and he's more reflecting the pulp fiction stories that he loved so dearly. And the Bond novels were entertainments, particularly for an English audience that was still dealing with the aftermath of World War II and rationing and bombed out areas of London. And, people weren't traveling the world or going to the incredible far-off place of America that seemed like a distant Never Land, or even going to Jamaica, which was still a British colony at the time. So this is being written not only in a different time, but for a different time and for a different audience. So the larger-than-life aspects of Fleming's prose are not only what make these books timeless and iconic and masterworks, but it was designed to be a sort of heightened reality particularly for a British audience at the time, and to have enough appeal on a global scale that American audiences could pick up these books and they might be more used to, say, Mickey Spillane novels or a more gritty, less literary books that were all about the pulp experience, but they'd be able to recognize something in these books and associate with them, even though it's about a British character. That didn't really matter. And this is the important factor that Cubby Broccoli in particular, but also Harry Saltzman and the core original team at Eon knew they had to maintain in order to make the film successful, because if it was too British, essentially, it wouldn't have that ability to transition globally, and particularly you wouldn't be able to crack the American market. So it took the books a lot longer to do this than the films did, but the films kind of got the benefit of seeing that eventually the novels did crack America. And Live and Let Die is further fascinating for us American readers because for the most part, Fleming's descriptions of America are fascinating because he's describing America in the 1950s. And in terms of the locales and the descriptions of American life, in terms of society and how even transportation worked, and very strikingly aspects of New York and Florida are so beautifully described. And some of the things Fleming goes on about are actually, as an American, I can say are not only spot on, but also still applicable today. I know one that's always stuck out to me that I'll never forget is that at one point Bond is basically having to try and pass himself off as an American to not stick out as an Englishman. And Felix Leiter tells him that you can get through any American conversation with 3 words, and they are yeah, nope, and sure. And that's still accurate to this day in 2024. So it's also a fascinating time capsule. That's another aspect of the Fleming novels that are fascinating. But again, it is very much a style change compared to Casino Royale, and it might feel slighter the first time you read it if you're coming to it after reading Casino Royale, if you're going through the books chronologically. But there's something to be said for the fact that nobody has ever quite written an adventure story, a pulp story with this level of literary insight and this type of wit and this type of style. It's really an original. It's not just that Fleming had an original voice, but he was able to apply his writer's voice into not only books that are trying to be more accepted as literary works, but also respecting the pulp adventure as an art form, because really it's probably the most difficult form of writing to master, and it's not properly examined as the art form that it really is. To talk a little bit about the plot, and in these videos I will try to keep them relatively spoiler-free in order to try and have something for both newcomers and longtime fans alike, but the plot is Bond is essentially sent to America to investigate essentially gold and priceless treasure that is flooding the American used market, that is actually coming from a lost pirate treasure of Bloody Morgan, which was supposedly lost somewhere off of Jamaica many, many years before during the days of high seas and piracy. And these valuable gold doubloons and pieces that are attributed to the lost treasure of Bloody Morgan have been appearing all over the United States in pawn shops and areas, particularly in New York. And it is essentially traced to the operations of one Mr. Big, known as Buonaparte Ignace Gallia, the first true, I think, Fleming supervillain, who is a black criminal with a phenomenally interesting background, who was actually trained by the Soviets and, of course, is an operative of Smersh, and is the greatest in his field in terms of being a gangster in the black community, not just in New York, but across America at large. And if that were not enough, not only is he a larger-than-life character physically, but he has an incredible presence and utilizes voodoo practices to try and further dominate those around him or those who know of him, to give him such an incredible presence that everyone he comes into contact is immediately fearful of their lives. So he is a larger-than-life character in terms of his sheer physicality and bulk, but also his extreme intellect and the fact that he makes sure to execute all of his crimes and operations with pinpoint precision. And he's done so for so long that it started to bore him. So he is a fascinating character in and of himself. And while Le Chiffre was a very striking character, he wasn't quite the full-on sort of Fleming supervillain. So I do think Mr. Big is really the first of the supervillains who's not only larger than life and memorable, but this applies to all the aspects of his characterization. And he is just one of Fleming's masterful villain creations. And some of the best moments in the book are the interactions between Bond and Mr. Big. And interestingly, there aren't a whole lot of those. Mr. Big is very much in the background a lot of times. So he's very much has his fingers on every aspect and has eyes and ears everywhere, because he has agents and operatives everywhere in all aspects of American life by using his influence and this sort of network of operatives that he has everywhere, but in particular in the service and transportation industries. So if you were to try and go anywhere, you would be spotted and traced immediately wherever you go in the country. So that's adding an element of danger to Bond's explorations and then the sort of adventure that begins. But essentially, the treasure that's being funneled through basically American pawn shops is also, as the intelligence services have been able to easily figure out, is being used to further finance Smersh operations inside the United States. So this is essentially a fundraising operation for Russian organizations to just undermine various aspects of American society. We're never told what those are, but it essentially, it's not the best idea to have the greatest enemy of the Cold War and who you're terrified of essentially having secret operations inside the country, kind of doing whatever they want to, and then funding it with this pirate treasure that they've discovered and using their super operative with all of this incredible control over a significant amount of the population, basically getting all this working capital to then carry out Smersh's directives. So that's the main thrust of the plot. And the reason why MI6 is involved is that Jamaica was a British territory at the time, so of course it is naturally in their jurisdiction for that section of the case. So Bond arrives in New York and is working in tandem with the NYPD and the FBI, but then the CIA gets involved because there is the out of the country element with Jamaica, and they send Bond's friend Felix Leiter from Casino Royale, and we get a great deepening of their overall relationship in this book. And it's very wonderful to see Bond not only have a friend and a direct link to the previous book, but it not only deepens, but it solidifies their relationship. And Felix is sort of Bond's extra gateway into the deeper, more nuanced aspects of American life, because Bond had not been to the States since really before the war. So it's been a while, and he has that sort of culture shock coming back into America. As they decide to go investigate Mr. Big's operations in Harlem, we have the classic sequence of Bond and Felix going from nightclub to hotspot till they get to the Boneyard Club that Mr. Big runs. And then Bond has his direct face-to-face confrontation with Mr. Big, and we're introduced to Solitaire, who is the love interest, and does seemingly have some occult powers of having second sight that Mr. Big uses in order to have essentially have the drop on all of his enemies. Bond is able to just barely talk his way out of the situation, and then before he can be manhandled, busts his way out and manages to kill a few goons, and then has to get out of New York fast. But Solitaire is actually trying to get away from Mr. Big and manages to at least partially convince Bond that she might be telling the truth. And so we then have the next section of the book take place on the Silver Phantom train, which goes from New York to Florida. And this deepens the connection between Bond and Solitaire, and is actually, I think, a really wonderful description of essentially train life of America in the 1950s. And it's also nice to have a different sort of dynamic between Bond and the heroine, as what we had in Casino Royale, because there's not so much an element of genuine connection or romance between Bond and Solitaire. She is very much a personified damsel in distress, in that she has to essentially be rescued by the hero from the dragon. So it's the idea of Bond as St. George slaying the dragon and rescuing the fair maiden. And Solitaire kind of winds up going back and forth between the two different sides. And while that sort of essentially makes her a pawn or a trophy or a damsel in distress, it's really playing around with that concept, and it's kind of trying to be a sort of classical adventure story in that way. So I know some people criticize the novel for Solitaire not being as necessarily three-dimensional or as refined as Vesper was in Casino Royale, but that's really missing the point. Solitaire is not a character designed to be like Vesper. She's a different character. And what I love about the book version of Solitaire is that Fleming does at least give her some spunkiness and some spirit in her dialogue, and she playfully interacts with Bond on the train, who has been injured and has his hand bandaged because and the memorable confrontation with Mr. Big, his pinky finger is essentially brutally broken on his left hand. So Bond is already injured throughout the rest of the novel. But the train sequence gets us all the way to Florida, and Bond and Solitaire manage to duck the agents of Mr. Big all the way throughout, and then wind up in Tampa, St. Petersburg, where they meet up with Felix Leiter again and investigate the local operations of Mr. Big there, because this is basically his secondary base, where somehow, some way, the transition is made for the treasure being mined out of his Jamaican operation. So this is the sort of entry point where the gold and treasure is making its way into the United States, and then somehow they know it gets to New York, but they just don't know how. And they know that there are certain operations and locations that Mr. Big has some connection to. In particular, a marine warehouse and supplier that Bond and Felix investigate, although it unfortunately doesn't go very well for Felix. Then we do have a transition to Jamaica for the final act of the story. So the book is nicely sort of split into sections. We have the initial drawing the reader in and the setting of the story, which basically shows how Bond gets to New York and acclimatizing to America. We have the rest of the New York section. Then we have the train, which gets us to the Florida section, and then the Florida section immediately jumps into the final act in Jamaica. So there's a nice sort of progressive flow, and the change of locales keeps the sort of exotic atmosphere going, which is peppered throughout with mentions of voodooism, because of course they are dealing with the villain who tries to use voodoo practices for his own gains, and that of course is merely designed to try and put people off of their game. And be as uncomfortable as possible. Bond doesn't necessarily put very much stock in this, but understands what this does to others. But Solitaire, being a character who grew up in voodooism, is very easily, at least she is a bit freaked out when they get messages threatening death, and of course signed in what are essentially statements of voodoo or voodoo curses. So that would be enough to sort of freak out anybody, but especially someone like Solitaire who grew up in voodooism and knows the what those words are designed to mean and the sort of feeling they're designed to generate in people. So it adds to the dynamic and the difference between Bond and Solitaire and how they play off of each other. There is a little bit, of course, of the inherent sexism that you get in the Fleming novels. Part of that, of course, is because these were books being written in the 1950s. But also, when you look at the Bond novels, there's especially here in Live and Let Die, there is a bit of it in Casino Royale, but there's a sense that when Bond is on a mission, he's sort of in battle mode. He's sort of in a particular mindset, not quite with blinders on, but it's a sort of hyper focus, and he doesn't have time for supposed distractions. And under that category would usually be women as well. So in Casino Royale, he's a bit upset when he's told at first that he's been assigned Vesper Lind as his assistant, but she proves her worth, of course. But Solitaire is, again, because Fleming writes her with at least some spirit and spunkiness in the dialogue, I think that starts to undercut some of the inherent sexism. And you have points in the novels, in both Casino Royale and Live and Let Die, where Bond sort of gets chided a little bit for his own inherent sexism, and sometimes he kind of chides himself a little bit. But it does seem that because he has this sort of battle focus when he's on a mission, that he sort of is dismissive more of things or of people, especially women as well, that maybe he wouldn't necessarily be as dismissive or sexist in normal everyday life. But again, part of this is inherent to the time in which the books were written in the 1950s, so that also comes into play. But I do think at the very least Fleming does undercut this some with Solitaire in terms of her actions and her personality, at least having some nice spunkiness to her, which I've always enjoyed. And that's something that I think Fleming brought to pretty much all of his heroines. So even with a character like Solitaire, who is pretty much designed to be riffing on the idea of the classical damsel in distress or the heroine who has to be rescued, it's playing around with that concept, but she does have at least a bit of a sense of self, even though she is herself more of a secondary character. We have the return of Felix Leiter, who is just a fantastic character, but of course meets a terrible fate in the novel, and all Bond fans will be aware because this was later mined for License to Kill. But this is where Felix is essentially thrown to the sharks and then maimed for life, and all of the rest of the novels, of course, appears with artificial limbs and a hook for a hand, and Bond forever carries a sense of guilt about what happens because he feels that somehow he should have been able to prevent this. So while it's a brilliantly striking moment in the novel, it does carry repercussions which help to develop both characters further. So this is another example of smaller elements that start to add up that make it really useful to read the books in chronological order. So while you can read them out of order, it does help because there are little building blocks that start to add up, and one of them is this novel deepening the Leiter and Bond connection, but then also twisting it onto a different path because of what fate befalls Felix Leiter. But one of the great sections of the book is, of course, Bond exacting a type of revenge upon those who did this to Leiter. And again, this whole notion would basically be the impetus for the film License to Kill. So that's another example of the Bond films just taking particular pieces that were just not used when the novel was adapted to a previous film. So they always make sure to keep an eye on things that maybe they haven't mined yet. And as I mentioned before, we also have the introduction of the secondary characters of Commander Stangways and Quarrel. And these characters, of course, most famously in Dr. No. But here, Stangways is essentially the MI6 operative in Jamaica, and Quarrel is, I mean, for lack of a better term, Quarrel is essentially the chief operative of Stangways and is an expert fisherman and seaman and knows all of the territory in and around Jamaica like the back of his hand. So he's the perfect operative for the MI6 office. And both characters are extremely well drawn, hyper detailed, and characters you actually come to love and appreciate right off the bat. And they both have that wonderful, nice, sort of larger than life quality that Fleming brought to all of his supporting characters on the, essentially on Bond's side. All of the ally characters have that nice spirit to them, whether they're Quarrel and Stangways or Karen Bay or Draco later on. So it's nice to see them here and to see their characters get more to do. And this, of course, sets up their return later when Bond comes back to Jamaica in Dr. No and makes what happens to the characters in that book even more impactful. So again, that's another reason why it's good to read the books in order, because this is another little facet that sets up what happens to the characters when they return. So there are echoes and connections like that throughout the books, which makes it important to read them in chronological order. Now, Bond himself, in terms of his characterization and where the character's sort of headspace is in the second novel, this is very much still building off of Casino Royale, but what that first book did is really crystallize Bond as a character. When you start Casino Royale, as I've said before, Bond is about, I'd say, 80 to 90% complete and fully formed, but it's the events of that story that firmly crystallize the character. It's the last experience necessary to make Bond 100% who he is as the character we all know and love. So that's why Casino Royale in ways sort of acts like a prequel in certain areas. And that's why it's much more character focused. But when you have that out of the way, here in Live and Let Die as the first straight ahead, essentially mission book, because we have the mission and then carrying out the mission and everything that happens on the way till the final clinch at the end of the book. Here, all of the character introspection is in the internal monologue, which Fleming could do better than anyone else. So this has all of Bond's musings, but it's all in the context of the mission and the job at hand, and it's all within the again, that sense of perpetual motion, that narrative drive, the Fleming sweep, as we all like to call it in the Bond fan community. So it's always in motion. So it's Bond reacting to things quite often, or trying to cope with the increasing danger of situations, or figure his way out of a new death trap scenario, or try to play another game of one-upsmanship with Mr. Big. So this is very much the same character that we saw in Casino Royale, but this is basically him a little bit down the road in terms of the amount of time. And we've had the sort of ups and downs of Casino Royale being the first major mission out of the way. So this is James Bond fully formed on a mission fraught with danger and reacting to it as best as he can. So it doesn't have the same level of ups and downs in terms of extreme downs, because the character makes plenty of mistakes in Casino Royale. He is still human in all the other Fleming novels, but in Live and Let Die, being the first book where we've got just Bond on a straight-ahead mission, there's not that sense of he's still a younger agent. In Live and Let Die forward, he is a fully formed agent and operative and operates in that fashion. So that is another reason why it's important to read the books in order, because when you read Casino Royale first, it makes sense in terms of the placement and helps to build elements of the character that if you don't read that first, you can still infer those elements in the other books, but you don't get as much of it expounded upon. But when you read them in order, each book builds upon the other, and everything that Bond experiences and all of his musings and stuff basically form a patchwork of who the character is overall. So it's interesting to note how Bond operates now, fully formed, but in a much more straightforward action-adventure pulp novel style. Casino Royale had some fascinating moments, but the real set piece is the central card game at Casino Royale. And then, of course, the other would most likely be the torture sequence, and then you could probably also call the final act and the culmination of the romance story the sort of third set piece in terms of the most memorable moments in the book, but the central card game is what the whole book revolves around. Well, Live and Let Die has multiple set pieces, some of which I've already mentioned, but of course you have Bond arriving in America, Bond and Felix going up into Harlem, into Mr. Big's territory, the first confrontation with Mr. Big and meeting Solitaire for the first time, and of course this involves the famous table in the nightclub dropping into the floor. All of these will be familiar elements if you know the film, because most all of them were mined for the Live and Let Die film and a few others for other Eon films. And then, of course, we transition to the wonderful train sequence, which is really wonderful and all about the romance of train travel. And, of course, it's even more a romantic way to travel when there's intrigue afoot and danger at every turn. It just makes it somehow even more romanticized. And then we have the events in Florida, in particular with the warehouse run by the robber, who's a fantastic sort of Mr. Big operative in Florida, and then discovering more about how the treasure is being smuggled, and the confrontation in the warehouse is, I think, one of the great sections of the Bond canon. Of course, Solitaire is recaptured, and Bond discovers what has happened to Felix, which is another of Fleming's most memorable and striking moments. Of course, he disagreed with something that ate him. And then we transition to Jamaica, which is basically setting the stage and then preparing for the final one-man assault of Bond on the island to try and not only uncover Mr. Big's treasure hunting operations, but also put an end to it. And this is achieved by Bond basically having a fitness regimen and being trained by Quarrel to then be able to physically make it through the underwater gauntlet of traveling through, swimming underwater through all the terrors of the deep and the things that could kill you, from barracuda to shark and beyond across the coral reefs, while trying to not be discovered. And Fleming goes into overdrive in the underwater sections, and it's absolutely bigger than life, and it's one of the most memorable sections of the novel. And then we transition to Bond's final confrontation with Mr. Big, which then leads to Bond and Solitaire famously being keel-hauled behind Mr. Big's yacht, the Secateur, which is the finale of the novel and was finally repurposed into the For Your Eyes Only film. Now, just mentioning the set pieces makes you want to go read the book, or read the book again, because they're so larger than life and so vivid that they really do help make the book feel as if you simply can't put it down, because you can't. So again, that ties into how the book is structured, much more like a straight-ahead pulp adventure. It is very much a Bond on a mission story, and it's the first time that we got that. So it's fascinating to look at the book in that sense, that it's the first Bond on a mission story. Now, so far, I've talked about all the book's positives, and I've briefly touched on some of the inherent dated aspects, but the big thing in regards to Live and Let Die specifically, and the thing that is most discussed and what you're going to hear right off the bat, is of course that, particularly because this novel deals with black characters, and especially the central villain is a black character with a whole network of agents within the black community at the time in the 1950s, and it being a book written in the 1950s by an Englishman, there is racism throughout the book. It is nowhere near as bad as it could be looking at books in similar genres, and especially pulp stories from this point and especially before, but it is extremely dated, and also it does have moments that do make readers cringe, so there is the cringe factor. So this is basically what I'm going to be covering here in the oh dear section. So when you cover the Fleming novels, you are going to come across dated elements, and whether it be inherent sexism or certainly outdated modes of thought, but also especially elements of racism, it is at its clearest here in Live and Let Die, because it is interacting in the black community to such a degree with black characters that it is much more prevalent throughout the book as compared to other books where it's not doing it quite as much. Dr. No is probably the second most for this particular aspect, but that is dealing with the Chinese community within Jamaica primarily, and you don't quite get as much of the cringe factor, if you will, in that book compared to Live and Let Die, where it is very prevalent. I think most anybody can understand that this was a book written at a particular time from particular viewpoints when they read the book. I myself was able to do that when I started reading the Bond novels as a kid, and I was, 8 or 9 years old, and I could very easily tell that there were things in the novels that were just not correct and not anything that should be viewed that way, and were very obviously certainly outdated modes of thought that were much more commonplace at the time in which the books were written and set. So I think that is very clear from the outset. However, I do think it should be stressed that at the very least there is a positive character in Quarrel, and Mr. Big himself as a character is hyper-intelligent and able to outwit Bond continually, so I don't think those are demeaning characters. I think the big problem overall is the fact that all of the dialogue for the black characters throughout the book is very much a racial stereotype, in that it features broken English and certain attempts at diction to try and indicate what is very obviously a racial stereotype. So if you read more fiction from the past, particularly of the early 20th century, and especially in the pulp and adventure genres, you're going to come across this pretty much everywhere. It was very commonplace, and it was thankfully at least getting better by this point in the 1950s, and you were seeing it less and less, and more people were speaking up that this was not only horribly inaccurate, but a racial stereotype, and very much unfair, and very insensitive, and very insulting. So it was at least becoming a bit more in people's minds that, hey, this isn't really a good idea, and this is extraordinarily insensitive and insulting, and just don't do that. But when you do look at the novel, you do see Fleming having both Bond and Felix and other characters expressing admiration for aspects of black culture and of some of the various black characters in the novel. So again, it's not entirely the worst thing in the world or 100% terrible in terms of how the racism is depicted in the book, but it is certainly there, don't get me wrong, and it is something that should be examined and discussed as you would with any work of fiction from the past that does have horribly dated elements. But there are elements scattered throughout that do show at least there is some level of progressiveness in Fleming, but as some have rightly pointed out, while there is a little bit of that, this is still an Englishman writing a book in the 1950s about a different culture, so that's only going to go so far, essentially. But at the very least, it's nowhere near as bad as it could be or as it was in other contemporary works, or especially works beforehand. If you read any sort of book or story or short story or pulp adventure anything that is set in a particular ethnic community, especially stories involving black characters or stories set within the Chinese community or set in various Chinatowns, they're not necessarily going to be, shall we say, the most realistic in terms of the stories set in Chinatowns usually are larger than life and feature all kinds of nefarious activities behind every dark corner. And it's like, well, Chinatowns really aren't like that, you know? And those stories feature essentially wall-to-wall racial stereotyping, and that was just unfortunately commonplace. And frankly, it was apparently seen as the preferred way to depict characters and locations at that time. And thankfully, this started to turn around, but it was very, very, very slow. And it took elements such as the famous Harlem Renaissance to start to get people to think about things outside of their limited worldview and about other people's perspectives. And it still took, unfortunately, even longer for the inherent racial stereotyping that you found, especially in fiction, to start to dissipate, especially in broad popular fiction, primarily being written by Caucasian writers. It took time for that for there to be a sort of sea change where you saw less and less of this. But there were examples, thankfully, of writers handling characters and situations very well without racial stereotyping. But unfortunately, those were fewer and further between. So by this point in 1954, things were at least better. And I think this is why we have the difference in the text. Live and Let Die is a book that exists in two different versions between the American edition and the original British text. Now, the Bond novels are no stranger to having little differences. Usually the American editors would request one or two little changes, usually in changing the British idioms or spellings to American versions. So for the most part, these are very minor little grammatical changes, so that Americans wouldn't be thrown off by British spellings and idioms and such. But Live and Let Die had a particular change. This was requested by the American editor at Macmillan, who first published the book in 1954-55. And this was, what it boiled down to was essentially removing a single passage that takes place in Bond and Felix's trip into Harlem. When they stop at the first nightclub, they overhear and listen in to a conversation that happens in the booth next to them. It's a conversation between a black couple, and it's extended. So basically the book stops and takes a pause, and we have about 2 pages of this conversation, and it's in nothing but the stereotyped dialogue. And while you get the sense that Fleming was thinking that he was doing a good job, shall we say, at trying to convey some slice of life or something that he put together in his mind, it's not really the way that people talked, and it's very much based upon racial caricatures. And it's the most notable example of the inherent racism of the book. And I think it was very wise for the American editor to request that that be removed, because even at that time, it would have rankled more and more of the American reading audience. And it's basically the inherent racism of the book sort of scrunched down and distilled into one 2-page section where it's very blatant because it's nonstop. We don't have Bond and Felix reacting. We have them, oh, what about this interesting conversation next to us? And we get 2 pages of this, and then we go back to the book. But also, I think it was wise of the editor to request its removal because it throws off the pacing of the book. The book basically stops for 2 pages, and we have this very stereotyped conversation, and then the book sort of resumes, and its removal does not change anything. It doesn't alter Fleming's world building. It doesn't alter the sense of Bond and Felix moving further into Harlem, which feels like they are more and more people sort of going into a different territory where they know very well that they may not be wanted, especially as they're moving into Mr. Big's territory. So its removal, again, doesn't alter anything, and I think it was very wise. Fleming did approve of these changes. The other major change is one sentence in the description inside of Mr. Big's club, the Boneyards, during the striptease sequence, is removed, where it is comparing all of those onlookers inside the hot, sweaty room watching this striptease act. It does make an allusion and direct comparison to all the people inside being like pigs at a trough. I don't think that Fleming in that line was necessarily trying to say anything that was racially based, because Bond and Felix themselves are there and feel their palms getting sweaty, and they're swept up into watching this striptease act as well. I think it was just trying to describe the air in the room, but it does have inherent negative connotations, so I can understand why that was removed as well. And that line's removal doesn't really alter the scene either. And those are the two major changes between the American and the original UK text. This was approved by Ian Fleming himself. He did sign off on these and understood why the American editor asked for them. This was the only time that Fleming approved anything like this outside of little grammatical tweaks and things. So that is why the book exists in two different texts. The other major change is the chapter of Bond and Felix going deeper into Harlem originally had a different title in the UK text. In the American text, it is 7th Avenue. Well, if you look at the UK text for the first time, you will notice a very not good, shall we say, chapter title, which unfortunately has a racial slur in it and seems very much off base and terrible, but actually it does have a reason for being there, and Felix even mentions this title in the section where the book basically picks up after that 2-page conversation ends, and Felix actually name drops this title in and around that conversation, saying that the couple that they eavesdrop on are right out of the title of the UK chapter. Well, the reason why that chapter is titled that and why Felix alludes to it is probably lost on modern audiences. I myself had no idea what the title was until I actually looked it up, and actually the UK title is in reference to a work by Carl van Vechten written in the 1920s during the time of the Harlem Renaissance. Van Vechten was a Caucasian author who wrote this book essentially about characters and black life in Harlem, and while he seemingly had good intentions, it also was hotly debated even then as a work of cultural stereotyping and inherent racism. So even then, it was not the most popular book, shall we say. But the title was the title of what's in the UK version's chapter and what Felix name drops. So that's what Fleming is actually having Felix Leiter reference to, is this particular book that was written much earlier, that was very well known. At least I would think it was still relatively well known in the 1950s. So it was actually a literary allusion to a past work that was supposed to describe aspects of black life in Harlem in America in the 1920s, but was itself based on ideas of racial stereotyping and things. I've not read the novel. I've just read summaries, and there is a pretty lengthy Wikipedia page, which I'll leave a link to if you want to know more. But essentially what I'm trying to say is that the original UK title, when you first see it for this chapter, you definitely cringe and you wonder, what was Fleming thinking? Well, he was actually thinking of a book that most people today have never heard of. So he did have a reason for putting it there, but in the past, unfortunately, people didn't think about how insensitive and just not good it was to have terms like that thrown around. And of course, famously, Agatha Christie's first title for And Then There Were None also used this racial slur, and that's why that was very quickly dropped from all subsequent printings of the book, and why the book was retitled 10 Little Indians first, and then people realized that that wasn't necessarily the best title, and then they went to And Then There Were None, which I think is a much better title dramatically anyway. And I do think Seventh Avenue is actually a more evocative title. It's very simple, but in that sort of dry observational wit style that Fleming had, and I think it better describes Bond and Felix's journey into Harlem. So that's the primary differences between the American and original UK text that Fleming wrote. Outside of that, everything else is pretty much the same, and all versions in America until Penguin took over the books in 2002 were the American text, and all versions in the UK and I believe all versions in Europe were the UK text without those changes made. And then here in America from 2002 until last year in 2023, when Ian Fleming Publications took over the rights, they were actually publishing the UK edition again, and no one said anything. And as a kid, I picked up the first Penguin paperback and flipped through it in a bookstore and was stunned to see that it was the UK version, and no one had said anything. So if you want the UK version, all you have to do is pick up any of the American releases from 2002 to before 2023. So whether it be the Penguin paperback or the Thomas and Mercer paperback, or whichever you want to go for, that's the easiest way to get the UK text without importing a UK copy. However, this issue is also important because this is the example and precedent that Ian Fleming Publications used recently when they took over the rights and were able to finally, as the estate, publish the books themselves for the first time. Well, they took this precedent and what happened with Fleming approving of the slight changes made for the American text of Live and Let Die, and used it to justify altering the other books in various ways. Some books were supposedly not changed, others had various aspects changed and tweaked, but of course, the original author was not around to approve of any of these, and it's bewildering that the estate chose to do this. They used a bunch of sensitivity readers to make suggestions, and it seems as if they made a bunch of changes in small areas in terms of text and alterations, but they didn't do so consistently and then didn't make any changes or tweaks to other dated aspects. So it's a very bizarre application of broken logic, and none of this obviously was approved by Fleming, who unfortunately died in 1964. So that is why you should avoid all of the modern reprints, whether it's the IFP releases in paperback and ebook in the UK, or the horribly designed, very cheap-looking modern US reprints in paperback and ebook, because they have a variety of different tweaks and edits and changes. Live and Let Die is reverted to the American text, and now that is published worldwide. So now everybody has the American version with the slight tweaks. But that is the only thing that Fleming ever approved of, and with this sort of broken logic, they've applied this to the other books in a sort of scattershot method, and that's not right. One understands they had the best of intentions, and that is perfectly admirable and fine, but they should have ensured that the original texts were still being kept in print and kept available, because those are the versions you should read, because to try and cover these things up not only alters the original work and changes the inherent time capsule nature and what the author was putting down on the page, but it also pretends as if these elements never existed, and that will only cause more problems down the road. And all it required was a simple, basic, well-worded disclaimer or an introduction at the start of the book, as certain past published versions have done. So my final thoughts on reading Live and Let Die for the umpteenth time and its placement as the second book in the James Bond canon, and displaying a sense of literary growth out of Casino Royale and taking Bond into a different direction, is that I I do think this is one of Fleming's most underrated novels. I think his more adventure-driven books are generally overlooked because they're not as accepted in the literary community as some of the other works. And I think he had such a mastery of the pulp adventure style, as he had devoured countless thousands of pulp stories throughout his lifetime. That was really it's really the lifeblood of what the James Bond experience is. And you need some degrees of that. This is where the larger than life qualities come in. This is where the action set pieces come in. This is where the Fleming sweep is at its most unbridled, and where the narrative drive is at full force. Some books, I think, do this better than others, but never was it as direct and as vivid as it is in Live and Let Die, which is basically a mission story with a straightforward plot where once the book gets going, it never stops. It's like a non-stopping freight train. So again, to have another train illusion. And once you get into that locked groove, you're in the Fleming sweep on this freight train all the way to Surprise Island at the end of the book in Jamaica. So for me, as much of a striking first novel as Casino Royale is, I do think you can feel Fleming stretching his legs out as a writer and really doubling down on certain aspects and building on the world he had created. And I do think it is one of his most underrated novels. And if I had to stack the books against one another, I do think this is actually a stronger novel than Casino Royale, but that's a bit unfair because they're different kinds of books. That's the thing about Fleming's Bond novels. No two are exactly the same. And while they sort of fall into the more literary ones and then the more pure action-oriented ones, they're not purely in those two categories either. There's some cross-pollination and there's different tones and styles within each book. He never wrote the same book twice. Even in the short stories, he never did the same thing twice, but all have a unified feel because they're all written with Fleming's inimitable wit and observational style, even though, as is very obvious here in Live and Let Die, that can very obviously contain dated aspects of elements that will definitely remind you that, unfortunately, we're still not terribly far away from times in the past where people didn't think about how nasty or insensitive they were being without, thinking about everyone else around them. So we do have to at least be thankful that we can reflect on these things and understand that we have thankfully moved forward in great strides, but it's still not that terribly long ago when these unfortunate things were much more commonplace. And for all that is said about the inherent racism in Live and Let Die, which is very much applicable because it certainly is there, it is, I think, when you read it, very obvious that it is nowhere near as bad as it could be, nor is it as prevalent as you see in other examples of adventure storytelling in particular, especially if you dig into what Fleming was inspired by in terms of past works and other works of adventure storytelling. So for me, I do think this is a stronger novel than Casino Royale because you get that sense of Fleming striving to have more energy and to have such a strong narrative drive, and it's such an experience that I think it builds upon the success of Casino Royale, but interestingly takes it into a different sort of path and continues this sort of loose chronology. So it is always important to read the books in order, but in trying to rank or compare Fleming's novels, it is a very difficult task because no two are alike. No two are exactly the same. And that's what makes them timeless in a way, because each one will appeal to different readers in different ways. All of them are great, but all of them hit differently with each reader. So it makes them feel a bit alive in that sense. So now, of course, we turn to the various adaptations, and chiefly the 1973 film adaptation of the novel Live and Let Die, released by Eon as the 8th James Bond film, and of course the first of the Roger Moore era. This is a transitional film in many different ways, and I know far too much about this film because it is my favorite film of all time, which probably makes me biased as a lifelong Bond fan, which has made me want to research every facet of it and the source novel all the more. But Live and Let Die as a film, rather interestingly, when you compare it to the book, while at first it seems like it deviates from the novel quite a lot, it's actually sticking quite close to the main story structure. And even though we have a plot tweak changing the treasure smuggling to essentially being a caper about drug smuggling being uncovered in terms of building a pipeline through Mr. Big's network in America to distribute the heroin being developed and manufactured by Kananga on San Monique, it's the same sort of story structure. San Monique takes the place of Jamaica, ostensibly because they had already, of course, made Dr. No, which was, of course, almost entirely set and shot in Jamaica. Of course, for some of the San Monique sequences, they were pretty much filming in Jamaica again anyway. But it's also rather similar to Dr. No. It echoes Dr. No. And that's because Dr. No, the novel, came after Live and Let Die and echoed Live and Let Die, plus had the reoccurrence of Stangways and Quarrel. And because the films were done out of order, any of the sort of loose continuity linking the books had to be reflected some way and had to be sort of massaged to address the fact that the films were done out of order in terms of adapting the books, or they had to just jettison it completely because it would conflict with the film chronology. So that's why you have the appearance of the Quarrel Jr. character, and again, it is fascinating to see how really the genius of Tom Mankiewicz, as I talk about time and time again, he is never properly appreciated, because what Tom Mankiewicz did in his one Bond film that he wrote solo, he managed to actually replicate every event of Fleming's novel, or at least reflect it in some form if he couldn't do it directly, such as the keel hauling sequence. He did drop some elements which would get reused for other films. Again, as I've mentioned before, the chief ones being the keel hauling finale was not used, although rather interestingly, if you think about it, Tom Mankiewicz actually came up with his own version that was more feasible and easy to do, and something you could shoot on a soundstage, and with the same degree of villain's malice and wanting to basically torture someone to death with blood in the water and having them possibly drown while also being eaten to death by a shark. So I think in 1973, it would have been extraordinarily difficult to shoot the keel hauling sequence. It's an incredibly difficult thing to even conceptualize. How would you shoot it in terms of for a film production? And it was difficult for them when they did reuse it and put it in For Your Eyes Only. So it's fascinating to note that Tom Mankiewicz even came up with a way to recontextualize the keel hauling sequence and keep the same idea and have that as your finale between Bond and villain with Solitaire there as well. So even when Tom Mankiewicz changed things, he found ways to reincorporate those elements into the story. It's really a genius adaptation in a lot of ways. And he focused extraordinarily hard on trying to eliminate the inherent racism of Fleming's novel and the dated aspects. He was the one who suggested that they even do Live and Let Die at that point because of what is now termed the blaxploitation craze that had started. It was a perfect time to finally adapt Live and Let Die, and it was a very problematic novel to try and adapt, even though it was just under 20 years since the book had been published. It was already very dicey to try and do as a film adaptation. You would have to do an exceptionally astute and careful job of adapting the novel and trying to address the very dated aspects, which Mankiewicz really did with utmost care. So that's why I have a major issue when people simply want to write off the film as Bond's trying to cash in on the blaxploitation craze, or it's the blaxploitation Bond film, or it's exploitative in some way. I think that's actually quite unfair, because when you read the novel and you think about how you're going to translate that to a film adaptation and address the issues of the inherent racism all throughout the book, one can only marvel and even develop a greater appreciation for the adaptation that Mankiewicz did. I think he made a lot of very smart changes. Updating the plot to be about drug smuggling was a very smart choice. It's maybe not as romantic an idea as smuggling secret pirate treasure, and he eliminated any of the connection between Mr. Big and Smersh, because the films moved away from the onset from being as politicized as Fleming's novels by making the Unseen Spectre organization that was developed later during the Thunderball process, making that the sort of primary recurring villain in the films instead of the Smersh organization, which was a very smart idea and keeps the films from being as dated in terms of being locked exclusively in the Cold War period, as the books very much are. So again, updating to drug smuggling was a good idea, if a bit less romanticized. Also, he focuses on highlighting the sort of personal one-upsmanship between Bond and Mr. Big, which is a key part of the Bond and Bond villain confrontation. And everything that Bond does in attacking the organization, or Mr. Big's machine, if you will, is taken as sort of a personal slight. So in the film, there's an even greater sense that Bond and Kananga are sort of going back and forth, and everything Bond does, and especially in regards to the Solitaire character, are personal affronts. So it's a personal battle between Bond and Bond villain in a greater, more visceral way that is felt in comparison to even the traditional Bond formula, which has some of that inherent. You need that sort of personal battle of wills with personal investment from both sides between Bond and Bond villain. But in the film adaptation, I think it's made even more apparent, because also we have Kananga and as Mr. Big actually more of a present figure in the story, whereas in the book it's much more of he's behind the scenes. And again, you have the added conceit further developed that Mr. Big has two faces. As Kananga, he can operate the entire actions on San Monique with diplomatic immunity of sorts and perfect cover, and then as Mr. Big, he has his own distribution network and again a secondary cover because he has this whole other guise. This is one of the elements that Mankiewicz really introduced himself, and is an interesting development, and I think builds on what Fleming had in the novel about Mr. Big being hyper intelligent and executing only the perfect crimes with natural covers developed by himself, so he is beyond reproach. But also Mankiewicz highlights the notion of Mr. Big's usage of voodoo, and while it's not done as matter-of-factly as Fleming has in the novel, you still have echoes of it. You have some of the paraphernalia, you have some of the iconography of voodooism, but Mankiewicz, along with Guy Hamilton directing, manages to infuse the whole film with a sort of exotic flavor that ties into the theme of voodooism being layered in throughout. So it really does pick that up from the novel and interestingly infuse that into the story as well. So it is carrying that theme onward. And then that ties into the film's revision of the Solitaire character. She is now given the dedicated power of second sight, and Mankiewicz changes this further by having this be linked to her status as a virgin, and if she is ever to consummate a relationship, she will then lose her various abilities and thus be useless to Kananga, and of course not be long for this world. And this, again, ties into Bond's actions all being sort of personal affronts to the villain, and this is most centered around the Solitaire character and her switch of allegiance to following Bond to get away from Kananga, as we have in the novel, but it's given a bit more grounding, and we have their relationship actually be consummated, whereas in the book, it's a more directly damsel in distress type scenario. There is still a little bit of that in the film version, because she is a bit of a she's not naive, but there's at least a little bit of naivete still left in the character as was originally created, which you need some of that. And if I had one criticism of the film version, it's only that I wish that there had been just a little bit more of the sort of spunkiness that is in Fleming's version in the original novel, and in particular seen in all the scenes between Bond and Solitaire aboard the Silver Phantom. But it's also a different rendering of the characters, so one has to keep that in mind. But again, one can only marvel when you know the novel and you know the film and you make a dedicated study of each. Mankiewicz did an incredible job of adapting the novel, dealing with the various issues, and also tailoring it to the time period in which the film was made, and also coming off of 1971's Diamonds Are Forever, which was the first film Mankiewicz was involved with and was an attempt to recapture the American audience after On Her Majesty's Secret Service and dealing with United Artists' concerns about the future of the series. So it in ways is a reaction to the success they had had on the previous film, which had a definite tonal shift, but also he had the incredibly difficult task of introducing a new actor in the role and then tailoring the script to try and better suit Roger Moore's strengths. And Roger Moore was coming into the role for the first time, and they had to, as you do with every first film in a new actor's tenure, you have to feel things out. You have to try some different things. You can't push things too far out of the Bond formula, but you have to develop the new characterization, essentially. But you have to ensure that it is still rooted in Bond lore and in Bond's character. So if that were not difficult enough, you again have to start blending the light and dark elements in terms of humor and levity and grit and gravitas and action adventure, because Live and Let Die is the most direct action and adventure story that Fleming would ever write. It's basically a one-man mission / one-man army type story long before that was ever a recognized genre, and the film actually follows this. It echoes Dr. No in a lot of ways, particularly once we get to Saint Monique, which is actually a quite brilliant way to introduce an actor in the role. So that's why Live and Let Die for Roger Moore actually does a lot of similar things to what Dr. No did for launching Connery in the role and launching the series. So in terms of certain plot elements and structure and how Bond is the central character and does quite a lot of detective work, that is why Live and Let Die and Dr. No echo each other, because that goes back to how the novels were written and how the novels naturally echo each other. But again, you have to keep in mind Live and Let Die was first, and then the film was made 9 years after Dr. No, the film. So while some may complain that the film has perhaps a bit too much of Sheriff J.W. Pepper throughout the boat chase sequence being a trifle long, I can understand those concerns, but it doesn't detract from the overall thrust of the plot or the story, and there needed to be some sort of extended action sequence, at least at some point, because that replicates certain events from the book that were either removed or transformed into other elements. The one thing besides the keel hauling that you don't quite get in the film is, of course, the final fate of Felix Leiter. Because the Florida sequences are removed entirely and mostly recontextualized into the New Orleans sequences, we basically transpose most of the events in Florida to New Orleans and sort of mix things around from there. We don't get the phenomenal scene in the warehouse and Felix Leiter being thrown to the sharks and Bond's discovery of the body. But like the keel hauling sequence, that was another piece of the novel that Eon basically kept in their back pocket, and whenever they felt they could use it, they would try to put these elements into other scripts. For example, the keel hauling sequence was originally actually put into Moonraker scripts, actually, before it was realized that that didn't really fit. So eventually, of course, the final fate of Felix Leiter, the warehouse sequence, the fight with the robber, and of course Bond's discovery of Felix's maimed body with he disagreed with something that ate him, covered in blood, was used in License to Kill. And like the films of the 80s, when Richard Maybaum and Michael G. Wilson in their screenplays would use a unused piece of Fleming, that would be the sort of foundation and building block to then have the rest of the story jump off from there. So License to Kill turns into a one-man army mission of revenge film that is motivated by the unused piece of Live and Let Die, which is the whole core of the story. And that was actually a very brilliant move because it's one of the most memorable passages of the novel. It's a shame they couldn't somehow work it into the 1973 film, but it also wouldn't exactly fit tonally with what else Mankiewicz had done. So it makes sense why he didn't use it there. But of course, that meant that Eon had it in their back pocket and then could turn it into the classic License to Kill as the jumping off point. But one thing the films have never done is have the deep friendship fully displayed between Felix Leiter and Bond, because Leiter is always a secondary character and he only appears sporadically in the series. However, once again, the genius of Mankiewicz strikes again, because when you look at Live and Let Die, the film, David Hedison's Felix Leiter is the most personable of all the Felix Leiters, and in spite of still being a secondary character and only having select scenes, he does appear throughout the film. And in terms of the dialogue and the performance, the Felix in Live and Let Die, the film, manages to convey a deep sense of knowing who Bond is and being Bond's best friend in the world, really, his only true friend in the world. And there's a camaraderie there that is in the dialogue, in the script, in the performances, and the way that Hedison and Roger Moore play off of each other and the way that Guy Hamilton directs them. So in spite of not having all of the sequences in the novel and not having Bond and Felix going into Harlem, Mankiewicz manages to replicate all of this and build the relationship between Bond and Felix more than any other film in the series. And that's why David Hedison is regularly regarded as one of, if not the best, of the screen Felix Leiters. It is the only Felix that manages to develop that sort of same working relationship between two agents infused with a very similar sardonic outsider's view of the world. It's really the first and only time you get that deep level of camaraderie feeling since Dr. No and Jack Lord as Felix Leiter. All of the Leiters are great, don't get me wrong, but I think one has to give Tom Mankiewicz even greater credit for how he managed to get the Bond and Felix relationship into the film, in spite of Felix still being a secondary character and only appearing in various scenes as the sort of go-between figure between Bond and the CIA, and not being able to include the maiming of Felix Leiter from the book. And Mankiewicz did want to go even further with some elements. In particular, not only did he strive very hard to not have the black characters be stereotyped or demeaned in any way, but also he designed the Solitaire character and wrote her to, in his mind, he wanted her to be played by Diana Ross, which is a very striking and, frankly, brilliant concept that would have been a real game-changing moment for not just the series, but for popular cinema at large. But it also would have been a real hot-button issue by adding the issue of mixed-race relations as part of the film. As it was, that is why there was a tweak made and a change made, and at least Mankiewicz was able to get that idea of Bond having relationships with black women as well, with the Rosie Carver character. And so that was sort of the way that they at least got that idea in there and that concept. So it is, of course, with the secondary character, but at least we have some echo of it there. But it also makes the Solitaire film version more in line with how Fleming originally wrote her, as sort of an innocent who grew up in Haiti primarily and was basically raised in the culture of the islands and voodooism as well. So again, I come back to it over and over. You have to look at the genius adaptation work that Mankiewicz did, while some of it is obviously very much attuned to the sort of audience expectations and flavors of the early 1970s and some of the humor. I think it has aged incredibly well for the most part, and is an extraordinary work of adaptation that doesn't get the credit it deserves. And it's interesting that this is the one script that he wrote solo without either rewriting Richard Maybaum or Richard Maybaum rewriting him. And of course, it was directed by Guy Hamilton, who had a sort of lighter approach to Bond. But this is the most action and direct plot-oriented Bond film he would direct, and it's the closest that Guy Hamilton comes to the Terrence Young style of the first two films in particular. So in spite of the additions and the tweaks and the very early 1970s flavor, Live and Let Die as a film actually, I think, perfectly reflects Fleming's novel. It's maybe not quite as cold or direct in terms of the ferocity of the violence and the darker elements, but they're all still present in the film and they're all echoed in the film. And I think it is a brilliant reinvention of the novel while keeping all of the themes and also Bond's outsider status with a license to kill all the way throughout. There's a darker edge in Bond throughout the film, which is perfectly reflecting Bond's state of mind from the novel. And it is an underrated film, an underrated performance from Roger Moore. It's arguably his best performance in the role, because every actor on their first time out has that sort of darker edge. Maybe it's coming from from feelings of indecision and becoming acclimatized to the role and having all that pressure on you the first time out. But it gives the performance an edge. And the first two Moore films have this darker edge because essentially they were sort of feeling their way through how the series was adapting and how Moore's take on the role would develop. So it is a brilliant adaptation of the novel that manages to address quite a lot of the problematic aspects of the book, and I don't think it gets enough credit for that. And when people criticize the film for being exploitative, I think that is actually quite unfair. If you actually have examined the film closely, and in the context of films coming out at the time, I think you'll find that it is reflecting the films of the time and trying to build off of what is existing in the film landscape and what Diamonds Are Forever had done. Live and Let Die is a much darker and more serious film than Diamonds Are Forever, which is quite surprising that they went immediately into such a different tone while echoing some of those similar ideas. It's also a precursor for a lot of action films that followed. Again, the sort of one-man army notion of tearing apart an entire criminal empire one element at a time. That's the plot of the book in terms of the structure. The film replicates this, but also no Bond film had quite done this to that level and been such a pure action-adventure film throughout. And we would see countless films after 1973 pick up on this and replicate this formula until it devolved upon itself. So I think it's important for its influence in terms of the plot structure of action films to follow, and it doesn't get the credit for that either. So I do think it is one of the best Bond films ever made, and I think it's one of the best adaptations of a Fleming novel because it's quite direct in a lot of ways, because the novel itself is the most action and adventure oriented and plotted with just a hard narrative drive that's like a freight train that doesn't stop of any of Fleming's novels. And the film absolutely reflects this in every facet, and again, I think should be examined as a brilliant piece of adaptation and another sign of the genius of Tom Mankiewicz. Speaking of which, if you adore the film as a Bond fan, you should, of course. The best overall presentation, sadly, is still on the 1993 reissue letterbox Laserdisc, which corrected some technical flaws of the first pressing, has a really good transfer for the time, but this still has the best presentation of the film's original mono mix, plus an isolated music and effects track. So you really need this, as it's worth its weight in gold, and at the very least, let's take the audio from this release and then sync it to the modern Blu-ray release, which itself is deficient and lacking, and the film, like the entire original Bond series, needs a 4K restoration and 4K release with proper transfers and proper audio. But of course, there have been other adaptations of the novel, particularly in comic form. We had 2 adaptations. Of course, the iconic Daily Express strip continued after the success of Casino Royale and adapted Fleming's Live and Let Die with the same beautiful artwork by John McCluskey, and of course is condensing the film down into daily newspaper strip form, so it takes on a very serialized and streamlined approach to the story. Like Casino Royale, we have all of the major set pieces and moments from the book nicely rendered in beautiful black and white newspaper strip form. It can be a little jarring if you're not used to how newspaper strips work and having a story told in daily or weekly strip form. So again, it is very much serialized, and it is essentially a great way to visualize elements from the book. My one criticism with this is that we do have a writer change. The Casino Royale strip was written by Anthony Hearn, but starting with Live and Let Die, all of the other adaptations, except for, I believe, Dr. No, were written by Henry Gamage. And with Live and Let Die being so plot-driven and so very much action-adventure in terms of it is a much more simplistic story, when it's adapted to comic form in particular, I think it does lose some of its flow and thus some of its magic and some of its drive, because it's broken up into panels, of course, and we don't have Fleming's wit and his prose. We of course have echoes of it because it's an adaptation, but the story just doesn't move in the same way. And I think with Casino Royale being so much more character driven and in a central location, I think that lent itself more actually to the comic form than Live and Let Die does. It's kind of strange to think about because Live and Let Die is so much more action oriented. It's still a well done strip, but I don't think it hits at quite the same level as the Casino Royale newspaper strip. Again, the artwork I think is phenomenal, very evocative of the 1950s, and strikingly, if you look closely, you'll notice that all of the black characters, even when it's the same scenes and some of the same dialogue in terms of the actual dialogue structure as what's in the novel, of course, the newspaper strip does not have the same degree of all the caricatured dialogue. So the inherent racism of the novel is actually quite lessened or removed in areas in the newspaper strip. This also happens in the other adaptations I'll talk about. So not only do you get that in the film, but you get that in the adaptations. And I think that allows somebody who's making a study of Live and Let Die it allows you to see what those scenes and dialogue and characters would be like if they talked more like actual people. So again, that's why I make the point that I think that the biggest issue with the racism that is very prevalent in the novel is most reflected in the actual dialect and the caricature of the dialogue that is being used by Fleming, that is very much in the unfortunate literary tradition that had become so ingrained in popular fiction over decades. So by reading the other adaptations or looking at the film, you can see those moments, and in particular in the comics, because they are replicating moments directly, you can see them without that dialogue, and it makes the scenes much better because you're not cringing so hard at the stereotyped dialogue. It's also important to note that the newspaper strip is doing this starting in 1958, so it's just 4 years removed from the publication of the novel. And when the American edition was done, the American editor was already asking for changes in regards to this specific issue. So even in the 1950s, people were already saying, this isn't right. We need to address this. And I think it really is underlined by the 1958 Daily Express newspaper strip adaptation that those elements are already being removed, and it is a distinct difference and improvement, and shows that at the very least we were moving forward, even though it was only in small increments. But again, I think that's a fascinating aspect to look at, the various adaptations addressing the inherent racism of the source material. Then, of course, there is the Dynamite Comics adaptation. This was done to follow the adaptation of Casino Royale, and apparently there were plans to perhaps do more, if not all, of Fleming's novels, as this was a partnership with the Ian Fleming estate. But unfortunately, only the first two books were done as graphic novels. This is from most of the same team who did Casino Royale. But as I feel with the newspaper strip, I don't think Live and Let Die, for whatever reason, actually translates as well to the comic medium. I feel very much the same way that I do about the newspaper strip. I think the Dynamite comic of Live and Let Die is well done, but I don't think it's as good as their Casino Royale adaptation. It does a lot of the same things. It is very much sticking closely to the novel, which is admirable and what you should do, but it does make a few tweaks in terms of the plotting in order to adapt to the comic medium, which of course anybody would have to do, but the story doesn't have the same dramatic weight to it. Also, I don't think the artwork, while it's still good, I don't think it's as striking as the artwork in Casino Royale. It's just, honestly, I have to say that I'm not a big fan of comic adaptations of novels in particular. I've read a number of them, and even ones like these that are well done and nice to look at, they don't really feel all that weighty, if I'm honest, especially if it's a book that I'm very familiar with, and especially a writer like Fleming, who was extraordinarily imaginative and extraordinarily visual in his descriptions. I've always been able to picture in my mind's eye as I'm reading every single bit of material Fleming wrote. I can envision in my imagination as I read, because he so vividly paints the scene. And when I'm looking at the comic, it doesn't always fit with what my mind's eye has always pictured. It's still a good comic, and it's an admirable piece of adaptation. It is well done. I just don't think it's overall as good as the Casino Royale comic, which I was actually quite surprised by when I first read it. I thought it was far better than what I expected. And also, again, I think it's somehow related to how the novel Live and Let Die is so much more action-oriented that it doesn't necessarily translate to comics as well as the more character-driven and focused drama of Casino Royale. There's just something about the fracturing of the story between panels, almost, that sort of interrupts the plot flow of Fleming's novel. So I think it was an admirable idea and attempt by Dynamite and the creative teams of the two graphic novels to adapt Fleming's work into the comic medium. But I think the newspaper strip, even though it's much shorter, actually does a better job of sort of getting the exotic flavor and charge of Fleming's novel. But I just didn't feel the Live and Let Die Dynamite comic really grabbed me as a Bond fan as much as their Casino Royale comic did. And then, of course, there is also the BBC radio adaptation. This was done, I believe, in 2019. It's one of the more modern ones that they've done. All of these modern BBC radio adaptations star Tovey Stevens as Bond, who does a quite good job in terms of the performance, and of course Bond in the radio medium. But these are, of course, adaptations of the books, and this one is about 90 minutes long. So it does have to condense down the book quite considerably, and the medium of radio dramas are quite different to an audiobook. So I'm admittedly a big fan of radio dramas. I devour classic radio episodes all the time. So I love the idea of Bond existing in radio drama form. You can listen to these dramas on the BBC website. They're also floating around everywhere. So I recommend all Bond fans give them a try just to experience the different medium. But I have to say, I'm not a fan of the adaptation that was done. It's similar to the comics, and you get the feeling that they did lose certain bits of the plot flow. But while I think both comic versions did a really good job of adapting the novel in terms of the constraints of the form, the radio drama makes some quite odd choices in its structuring and also in what it chooses to leave out. Of course, with a limited runtime, you do have to make some bold choices, and you also have to properly translate things into an audio-only medium. But also the feel is a bit odd. I think Toby Stephens makes for a great radio James Bond, and I think by far and large he is the best part of this adaptation. I think I think all the other performances for essentially for the British characters are well done. It's the American characters and even Mr. Big himself that I don't know if it's just because of the voice actors they chose, but also that combined with the writing, and this may be me as an American just feeling this, but it seemed like all the American voices, all the American characters and Mr. Big himself just felt a little bit off. And in particular, Mr. Big and Solitaire don't feel quite the same as the way Fleming wrote them. Also, some of the music choices were very odd. In particular, the music that's used during the warehouse sequence in Bond's fight with the robber before exacting the so deeply deserved revenge is very off-putting and an odd choice. And it's also strange to hear elements such as the keel-hauling finale translated into radio form, but in the context of a modern radio drama, it's a bit of an odd fit, and it's an odd listening experience because there are some really great elements. There are some moments really well adapted directly from the novel, but then there's a lot of other stuff that just doesn't feel quite right. And because it's in such a short time frame, they had to throw out so much of the book that it just doesn't feel the same. And it feels like it kind of goes in fits and spurts a little bit. But again, as I talked about the comic adaptations, just like both comics, all of the sequences from the novel that are replicated with the racial stereotyping and the stereotyped dialogue have been changed to have the same dialogue, but spoken like a normal person. And again, it makes those scenes much more realistic and without the same cringe factor that you have from reading the original book. So here in the radio adaptation, you have an even more visceral version of addressing this problem because you have the dialogue actually being performed by actors who are not using the very stereotyped dialogue, and it does make the scenes play so much better. So it's interesting to not only look at the comics doing this in both the newspaper strip and the Dynamite version, but also in the radio adaptation. So you've got 3 different versions of some of those same sequences from the book without the very dated inherent racism of the stereotyped dialogue. Now, to briefly talk about some of the book covers, as I like to do, the original Jonathan Cape UK First Edition has the very striking but very sort of plain in a way, a purplish pink background with the title in gold and also given a certain stylization to the font to, of course, suggest the pirate treasure that motivates the whole plot, the treasure of Bloody Morgan. So it's a striking book jacket in terms of the colors and the design and layout, but it's also quite plain, and it doesn't necessarily suggest the just the absolute passion of the adventure inside of the actual book, what you get on the pages. It doesn't necessarily give you the spirit of the title, Live and Let Die. So this is a case where, while the UK First Edition is an absolute classic in terms of the artwork, I think it's actually outdone by the American First Edition, which gives you the same feeling of the lost pirate treasure, but this, of course, takes its imagery from the fantastic underwater swimming the gauntlet sequence where Bond swims to Surprise Island and all the dangers of the deep await for him. And we even have the tentacles of the octopus that he'll do battle with, and we have Bond depicted in an old-fashioned aqualung with only a spear gun, and there's a beautiful sense of the dark, just depths of the ocean, and then we even have the gold doubloons being sort of let go to the surface and swimming up going through the tendrils of the octopus tentacles. So this is a very striking cover. It's very attention grabbing. It really replicates a scene from the book, but adding an even greater sense of mystery and atmosphere and a sense of dread too. So while it's not necessarily what I would have chosen to encapsulate the whole book in a single image, it actually manages to in a certain way, even though it's just focusing on the underwater sequence. So I think this is one of the cases where the US artwork for the first edition is not only extremely striking, but I think actually superior to the original Jonathan Cape edition. But if you wanted to take this theme even further, the first time the book was excerpted in Blue Book magazine, just before the actual book was published, there was a custom painting for both the front and back cover with a wraparound effect. And this goes even further by depicting the scene slightly later when Bond is trying to swim under the yacht Secator, and it runs into all of the essentially the major traps set by Mr. Big by having all of the great fish of the sea surrounding the ship being tempted by blood and offal. And so Bond is being menaced by the Barracuda, who actually attacks him and takes a chunk out of his shoulder. And this is depicted here in full color with the Barracuda and Bond bleeding out of his shoulder. Incredible detail of the depths. We even have the propeller of the yacht up there. We have the shark swimming around the blood and guts being dumped in the water. This is a phenomenal cover. This is a pulp magazine type cover in terms of intensity. So I think this is an incredible painting. I think it's a shame this was not used on a book jacket. But again, this is how the book was first glimpsed in the American market in this essentially excerpted serialized version. And I love how it's credited in this issue of Blue Book as voodoo spy novel, Live and Let Die. If anything ever was a voodoo spy novel, it is Live and Let Die. In terms of paperbacks, we had the iconic Pan series do its own version in the UK of Live and Let Die artwork over several different print runs, very much in a traditional, I guess in a sort of way, a sort of mixture of a traditional hero cover with elements of a pulp magazine cover. And the Pan paperbacks are highly collectible for this reason because they all have beautiful artwork done in a nice uniform style. I do have a copy of the later Pan with the artwork by Raymond Hockey of the iconic image of the skeleton hand with seemingly some of the doubloons coming out of the sand. This in the style of all of the 60s Pans with the Bond logo on the top really bold. These all have beautifully designed covers that are highly collectible and striking. It's just very difficult to get these here in America in good condition without paying through the nose, so I only have a couple of these. But otherwise, it seems to be replicating the sort of layout and design you would find in the earlier Pan paperbacks. These are a little bit more common and a little bit less expensive, but they're getting harder to get in good shape at a decent price, and especially here in America where you were not really seeing these all the time. In America, we had some really fantastic paperback covers, but before the Signet edition started coming out, there was this phenomenal cover done for the Perma Books release with artwork by James Meese. This is a pure pulp magazine cover for the book. And like all the first American paperbacks, it is very much a pulp magazine image, really designed to grab the reader and show them a very two-fisted, red-blooded guy on the cover in a book cover that's essentially designed to grab somebody who would otherwise be reading a Mickey Spillane novel or something off the paperback rack in a drugstore or a train station or wherever they were. But this one in particular, I think, is the best of the American sort of pulpy covers because it's depicting the exact moment of the book when Bond is discovered at the end and brought to Mr. Big on Surprise Island. It is a perfect visual representation of the scene. The only thing is that they've added Solitaire there when she's, of course, been captured and is tied up, whereas in the book, Bond is then taken and thrown into essentially a prison cell with her. But that's, of course, dramatic license. But it's got beautiful staging, beautiful color, beautiful detail. I think the representation of Mr. Big is phenomenally well done at recreating the character from the book. Bond is exactly as he is in the book, and the artist even has the wound from the barracuda bite with the blood on his shoulder. It's just a brilliant piece of work, and we even have the pirate treasure of Bloody Morgan right there inside of the cave and the desk or table that Mr. Big is sitting at. So it's a perfect visual realization of the final confrontation between Bond and Mr. Big, and a brilliant cover. Then, of course, we had the first Signet cover done in their early style, which is nice and very attention-grabbing, and I like how Mr. Big is done entirely in shadow with only his eyes visible. But for me, the most iconic version of Live and Let Die in terms of the book, the version I always think of, the version I always read, will always be the mid-1960s classic American Signet paperback with the amazing Barry Phillips artwork nicely tucked in there in the same design as all the other Signets, and especially the bold orange used for the book cover. This is a later printing which adds the 007 Pages logo, but otherwise is in the same design. And then on the rear, you have the updated back cover because they changed to the later photograph of Fleming and update the text to reflect Fleming's death in 1964. This, of course, has the iconic red-edged pages and the Signet layout in terms of font style and that particular unique smell that you only get from the 60s Signets. This, of course, like all American editions, is the American text, but this is the version I read as a kid. This is the version I read every year. It is always this particular copy, and the Signets will always be my go-to. I do have the UK text to refer to, but this is my childhood copy. This is still my favorite edition, and I think this is, in my eyes, the definitive Live and Let Die in terms of cover, artwork, design, and overall appearance. Of course, there were other editions after this point, and particularly in the early 1980s, Jove Books took over and did a few of the Fleming novels, but it wasn't until the John Gardner era of continuation novels really took off that we saw a whole relaunch of most of Fleming's work, and that was in the same sort of design. So here's Live and Let Die in the Berkeley edition. Eventually, these would all or mostly be republished under the Charter imprint as well, but this has the same design as the Gardner books in terms of the layout of the American editions, and then there's always some sort of Bond pose here. And then on the back, we have some of the others. So you can see, of course, there are different Bond poses for each book. The overall design is the same across the books, just a different color is used in terms of the actual book jacket and titles. And then we get the custom description of the book. Inside, we have the same exact font layout that started with the Jove editions. And this is identical to how the John Gardner books are published. What I've always loved about these is that the font is reset in terms of it's much easier to read. I've always loved how all of the John Gardner books from the 80s in their paperback form are designed. So it's very easy to pick these up and read these in terms of the font being very easy on the eyes. This, again, like all American editions, is the American text. It's gotten quite difficult to get all of the Fleming editions if you want to collect them this way. Again, most of Fleming's books were published in this format. They might seem a little generic at first, but there's a certain charm to these, and they're nicely done. But while you can get the Gardner books most anywhere, the Fleming reprints in this series are usually very difficult to come by, and especially getting them in good shape now at a decent price is very difficult. And some of them are extremely rare, like the version of Moonraker from this series is very hard to get. But these are still fun versions of Fleming to get, and this is what you would have gotten in the 1980s. In the 90s, there wasn't very much, especially here in the US. However, there was the series known as the James Bond Classic Library of hardcovers that did most of Fleming's novels and then kind of went out of print very quickly. They have very stylized sort of cartoonish looking covers with moments from the books depicted with really bold color choices. Live and Let Die here again uses a scene with Bond and the Barracuda in the final underwater sequence, and it's really striking and nicely done, even if it has a sort of less realistic look to it. So I think it's one of the better covers. I don't think it's as good as the previous underwater covers, but I think it's still a very good cover and very attractive looking. So it's a nice addition if you want to collect it just for the jacket artwork. Then, of course, we move from that point all the way to about 2002 when Penguin took over the publishing of the books and introduced the beautiful Uniform series of trade paperbacks and oversized paperbacks. And this was the first time we had the original UK text published anywhere in America. So from this point until the reprints in 2023, the UK text actually became the default standard text worldwide because Penguin was handling the books and then others would do the same. So this has really beautiful artwork in the same uniform style as the other 2002 Penguin covers. We have Mr. Big and the gold doubloons and a very wonderful sense of a 50s pulp atmosphere. And we have Solitaire in a very suggestive pose that is very evocative of a classic 1950s pulp cover. So there is a good case to be made that the 2002 Penguin covers for all of the Fleming novels are not only some of the best Bond covers ever made in terms of the book artwork, but also each one really gives you a sense of the entire book as a whole, and probably better than any other cover has done. I'm just kicking myself that I didn't buy these back in the day because I was a broke teenager who already had all my Signet copies, and I didn't think it was important to buy the Penguin editions because, again, I was a broke teenager and I thought these would be around for a while. But unfortunately, these have all disappeared quite quickly, and now it's quite costly and a bit hard to track down all the Penguin editions in good shape if you just want to collect them for the amazing covers. Now, I think these covers were sometimes used in the UK and Europe, but unfortunately, most editions in the UK went for this more generic style, shall we say. So this is the major 2000s era Penguin paperback of Live and Let Die from the UK, and as you can see, they've gone for this extraordinarily generic sort of style, and then all of the books had the same sort of text and font layout for the cover, and then a sort of standard image. These are very generic. They're definitely not the worst Bond covers, but they're nothing compared to the amazing American 2002 Penguin covers that perfectly give you the flavor of the book. But this is still, around and very affordable, and this is my copy of the UK text because it has the original UK text as all editions did basically from 2002 to 2023. But this is how I read the UK text, and it's an okay cover. It's otherwise just a standard paperback with a very standard font, and it's nothing really to write home about, but at least it's not the worst cover for the book. After this point, there were several different relaunches of the books, the biggest one being the Thomas and Mercer series, which had the black, white, and red covers for each of the books. And these covers are mostly okay, but they're also extraordinarily simplistic, and I'm not really a fan of them. However, I do like the color aesthetics of them, and they do form a nice uniform set, so that is, of course, another good way to get the UK text, because that version is still at least floating around on the used book market. Then there was the Uniform series of UK editions with unique artwork, both in paperback form, and then the lovely series of hardcovers with paintings of various female figures for each book. Although the one for Live and Let Die, as some book covers have done, is a bit more evocative of the film than the actual book, because the beautiful woman on the cover is not really Solitaire, and so that the character depicted here on the book cover isn't really anywhere to be found in the actual novel. So sometimes you can tell the artists were clearly more influenced by the films than the actual books, but it's still a nice cover. Then we move into the modern reprints when Ian Fleming Publications took over the books, and so you had the estate actually handling the books. This, of course, was when they implemented their very ill-advised plan to edit the other books, and Live and Let Die has reverted to the American text, and now the American text is what is available and being sold worldwide in both physical and ebook form. In terms of the artwork, IFP came up with this series for the UK editions in terms of the paperbacks with a large 007 logo and covers that at least have the flavor or some imagery you can associate with the actual book. I think some are better than others, but honestly, I'm not really a big fan of this design. However, it is at least a design and took somebody some time, and you can tell some thought went into it. When you look at the 2023 Harper Collins American paperbacks from the new Ian Fleming Publications text of the censored and changed versions and the American text of Live and Let Die, you have the single most generic and I think without question the worst covers ever put on any of Fleming's Bond novels. These took zero time to make. Some of them use stock images from online photo suppliers. They use the most generic form of the 007 logo. They just reek of zero effort. And the actual books themselves have a very cheap feel to them because I've actually looked at them in my hands in a Barnes & Noble, and they're just terrible. They have zero effort put into them, and these covers have no life to them, and the stock images are just... these aren't just uninspired. These are dire. These are just zero effort and without question the worst covers to ever be put on any bit of James Bond material. So I would advise people to just go for any other edition with a good cover. These are just... they reek of zero effort. And as a lifelong fan of the literary James Bond, I hate how the American editions and American publishers really don't seem to give a crap about the literary James Bond. We usually have to wait months for new books to actually come out here in America, and they're not supported or marketed well at all, if they're even marketed at all, because even these reprints certainly weren't. But this is a new low for the American publishing side of Bond novels in the current day and age, and I really think Harper Collins clearly shows that they really didn't give a crap about these, and they just felt like they just had to throw them out there. And yeah, these covers are awful. So those are my overall thoughts as a lifelong Bond fan and obsessive, rereading the Fleming canon once again, as I try to do every year, and my further reflections on Fleming's second novel, 1954's Live and Let Die. This is, without question, the most directly action-oriented and pure action-adventure escapism work that Fleming would ever write. It's also the first of these sort of purely action and more pulp fiction-oriented style of Bond novel that Fleming would return to in books such as Diamonds Are Forever and Dr. No, and shows how he sort of wrote his Bond novels in roughly two different sort of styles, the more literary oriented, if you will, and the more directly pulp action sort of style. And it's both of those elements that form the exotic and the magical appeal of the literary James Bond. And each of the books has some of those, but the overall tones and styles and plots of the books sort of separate into these two camps. And I think all Bond fans will appreciate both, but generally I think when you're reading the Bond novels, you'll find that you usually sort of prefer one over the other in terms of the overall style. I myself do admittedly lean more towards preferring the more directly action-adventure pulp-oriented books, because that is really the core of the character and all of the past works and works of literature that Fleming was so directly inspired by, and what Bond is a natural development of. So I think it's an extraordinarily important novel. I do think it's one of Fleming's best novels, and I do think it shows an incredible growth and confidence in terms of the writing over Casino Royale, which itself was an amazing debut novel. But I do think the book is overlooked. I think a lot of people coming to the Bond novels for the first time are really blown away by Casino Royale and the character introspection without realizing that each book is a little bit different. So when they come to Live and Let Die, they feel it's a bit of a coming down from the heights of Casino Royale in terms of the characterization. While it can be seen that way, it's also a different book. It's Fleming saying, well, now that I've done all that stuff at Casino Royale, now we're going to have a straight ahead mission story, essentially. Like people like to talk about the films being sometimes more oriented in the classic series to being a mission and plot oriented film. Essentially, this is the most basic Bond book in terms of this is the basic elements of the Bond story, of being assigned the mission, of going through the plot and attacking the villain at every turn and dismantling his organization one at a time, and meeting one of the most beautiful women in the world. And of course, she is involved in the story and becomes the love interest and is the heroine, and all the classical elements of Pulp Fiction being reconfigured into the James Bond formula that Fleming was developing as he was going along. And again, none of the Fleming novels are the same. They are all different and unique, but they have core elements and they all start to flow into one another, and you can see where Fleming's headspace was at that time. But this being a 1954 novel being written by an Englishman who grew up in a particular time and also was immersed in the popular culture of those times, particularly in other literary works before this point, because this book is dealing with black characters and a certain ethnicity, it is extraordinarily dated and filled to the brim throughout with the racism of the time and the racism of this entire literary genre anytime it dealt with other cultures or ethnicities. So that has to be examined. It's always going to be a part of this book because it is throughout this book. So you do have to look at this with the historical context of when and where it was written and who wrote it and what their background was. It is by no means as terrible as other works with these same problems are, particularly works from before this point in the genre, but it is indicative of what this issue meant in terms of genre works, and also shows how the various adaptations have tried to deal with this and managed to eradicate a lot of this problematic issue in terms of the how it is contained within the story and these characters. There is at least some of the author trying to have some. There are some progressive views in there, but they are very much outweighed by the racism that's everywhere else. And reading this, you obviously will cringe quite a bit, and you will understand that this is from a different time period, and this should be examined for what it is and discussed. That is, perfectly fine. That's how a reader should process works from the past with problematic materials. But again, I do think the American text does actually not only address this somewhat by making the major change, but I do think it was a very important change to help with the plotting of the novel, because that 2-page passage really stops the book cold for a full 2 pages. And I do think the American chapter title is actually a better and more evocative title. So I have no problem with the American text being the text that is available, because it's the only time that Fleming actually authorized changes during his lifetime. And they are very minor changes, and we know specifically what they are. This being used as a logic to then say that all the other books can be tweaked all these decades later without the original author's consent and be changed without really telling people what was changed, and it being done in a very slipshod and almost seemingly random manner is reprehensible, to say the least. It is a very unfortunate decision the estate has made. So while at the very least Live and Let Die can still be purchased and enjoyed in the current editions, and it be an actual form of the book that was still reflective of the author's work and was approved by the author for the minor changes made, all of the other books should be avoided in all editions from 2023 onwards, because they have been altered without the author's consent. So that's why Live and Let Die is a bit more tricky to discuss now because the Fleming estate has used the 1955 American text, slight alterations that Fleming approved, to sort of be a backdoor into explaining away their decision to alter the other works in various ways long after the author was no longer with us. So that is a form of revisionism, and really, in spite of all the good and understandable intentions, is literary vandalism and desecration of art, and should not be supported and should not be done anywhere, because if you start down that path, then there's no telling where that's going to go, and how much other works will be further altered, or where you even stop with that. So it's important to look at the two texts of Live and Let Die for that reason as well, but it also makes for a fascinating literary comparison and to see what Fleming was after. So I think all fans should not only read Live and Let Die time and time again and have a copy on their bookshelf, but I think you need to have both a copy of the American and the UK original text to have both versions of the book and see how each plays differently and be able to make comparisons for yourself. So again, these have just been some of my lifelong observations and thoughts about the literary James Bond, Ian Fleming, and the world of the novel Live and Let Die, which I do think is one of Fleming's masterpieces, despite having the inherent issues of the racism contained within the original work, written in 1954, that obviously will be examined and discussed by all readers as any sort of problematic material evocative of the past will and should be, in a sort of historical way of looking back at the past and recognizing different elements that thankfully we have put behind us, at least for the most part, or at least to a certain degree. So we are at least at a better point than we were then. But it is, I think, a remarkable work as a second novel, and shows that Fleming was not content to rest on his laurels and just try to write the same book again, and should be commended for that. And also he found a way to use his own particular style and writer's voice to create a new pulp adventure to reflect all of the pulp adventures he loved so dearly that inspired him to create the James Bond character in the first place. So as always, please keep supporting local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to pick up some beautiful further James Bond editions for different covers and printings, and of course for the other books having the original unaltered text of Fleming's works. And also keep reading print books, always keep bonding, and thank you ever so much for watching. When you have so much in your head about your greatest obsession, how do you get it all into a video and even somewhat focused and get over your nerves? And why do I do this to myself?
Why do I do this to myself? I do not know, but I do these things, and I put more stress upon myself. And then I feel bad that my video is not 92 hours long, even though it winds up being 3 hours long.